A rich woman saw a giant cowboy and begged, "Please give me strong sons." His reply changed. The Beaumont mansion was a gilded cage exuding quiet oppression, desperate loneliness, and a chilling fragility. Isabella stood before an ornate mirror seeing not her famed beauty, but the wolves circling her inheritance. Her late husband's will was a death sentence in fine calligraphy: produce a male heir or lose everything to his kin vultures in mourning clothes. Beneath the silken pearls was a core of pure frontier grit. She had exhausted every proper avenue, every polite prayer. All had failed. Now she would find her own solution. Through the lace-curtained window, she saw him for the first time. A man built like a mountain, effortlessly clearing a fallen oak from the path. A giant, a force of nature, an answer. A terrible, brilliant, and dangerous answer began to form in her mind, a plan that would shatter every rule she had ever known. She needed strong sons to protect her future, and in the untamed wilderness, she had just found her stallion. The Beaumont mansion was a gilded cage, a monument of polished mahogany and imported crystal set against the raw, aching wound of the West. It was a place that did not smell of sagebrush and dust, but of beeswax and the faint funereal scent of stale roses. Within its walls, the air exuded a quiet oppression, a desperate loneliness, and a chilling fragility that clung to Isabella Beaumont like her own shadow. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 3, each chime a golden hammer driving a nail into the coffin of her future. She stood before an ornate, silver-backed mirror, a stranger in her own reflection. The woman who stared back was a porcelain mask of high society, her mourning dress a sheath of black silk. But beneath the surface, a desperate fire burned. Her late husband's will was a death sentence in fine calligraphy: produce a male heir, or the entire Beaumont legacy, the mines the railroad shares, the very ground beneath the town of prosperity, would fall into the grasping hands of his cousin, Lucius Sterling. A soft knock preceded his entry. Lucius did not wait for an invitation. "My dear Isabella," he purred, his smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He ran a gloved finger along a marble tabletop, checking for dust she knew was not there. "Grieving becomes you, but grief is a luxury. The estate requires a firm hand." A man's hand. Isabella's spine stiffened. "My husband entrusted it to me. He entrusted it to his lineage." Lucius corrected, his eyes glinting. "Something only a son can truly carry. You understand." He paused at the door, turning back to her, his voice a silken threat. "The clock is ticking, Isabella. For all of us." The door clicked shut, leaving a silence heavier than any sound. She had to escape. She fled the suffocating quiet of the house, ordering her black mare saddled. She rode out not for pleasure, but for breath, for a moment's reprieve from the closing walls of her life. Her pristine riding habit was an insult to the wild, untamed land that stretched before her. The path narrowed, winding up into the foothills where the air grew thin and the world of men felt a world away. That's when she heard it. A sound that did not belong, the sharp, visceral crack of splintering timber that echoed through the pines like a gunshot. She reined in her horse, her heart suddenly a frantic drum against her ribs. Through a clearing, she saw him. He was not a man. He was a piece of the mountain given leave to walk. His shoulders were as broad as a yoke of oxen, his back a landscape of raw coiled power, as he lifted the trunk of a fallen pine, a tree that would have taken 3 townsmen to move, and tossed it aside as if it were a stick. His hair was a wild, dark mane, and his sheer size blotted out the sun. The townsfolk whispered of him. A hermit, a monster, Goliath. The thought struck her not with grace, but with the brutal force of a lightning strike. It was an idea born of pure distilled desperation. A terrible, brilliant, and dangerous answer to an impossible problem. She turned her horse around, galloping back toward the gilded cage she called home, her mind a maelstrom. This was madness. It was ruin. It was a sin against God and society. But it was also a throne. It was survival. Beneath the silken pearls she felt a core of pure frontier grit harden within her. She would not be a victim in her own story. She stormed back into the mansion, her cheeks flushed, her eyes burning with a feverish light. She marched past the ticking clock, its judgment now meaningless. She was leaving the world of polite society of rules written by greedy men. She was riding out to meet the wilderness on its own terms. She was a queen marching to petition a god of the mountain, a god of muscle and earth. She would not ask for a miracle. She would bargain for one. The path up the mountain was no more than a deer's memory, a faint track that clung to the edges of steep granite cliffs. Isabella's world shrank with every upward step of her mare, the manicured streets of prosperity becoming a toy town in a dusty basin below. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine and cold, clean stone. She was not afraid of the height nor of the cougar, whose cry echoed like a lost soul in the canyon. She was afraid of the abyss she was stepping into within herself. Her porcelain resolve was the only thing holding her together. After an hour, she found it. His cabin was not the crude hovel of a monster, but a fortress of solitude. Built of river stone and thick hand-hewn logs, it seemed to fit into the mountain as if it had grown there. Wind chimes, crafted from polished bone and sea-worn glass, sang a low, lonely song in the breeze. A small, meticulously tended garden bloomed with herbs and wildflowers, a defiant patch of life in the rugged landscape. This was not a lair. This was a home. Then he appeared. He did not emerge with a roar, but with a silence that seemed to drink the sound from the air. He filled the doorway, a colossus of sun-darkened skin and muscle, his shadow falling long and cool across the ground. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Up close, his size was even more intimidating, a testament to a life of brutal hardship. But his eyes, they were not the eyes of a beast. They were the color of wet slate, ancient and startlingly intelligent. They watched her, not with menace, but with a profound, weary curiosity. She dismounted, her movements stiff, her rehearsed words feeling like ash in her mouth. "Mr. Kane." I presume she said, her voice a clipped, fragile thing in the vast silence. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I am Mrs. Beaumont. I have a proposition for you." She forced herself to stand taller to summon the authority that came with her name, her fortune. "It is a business arrangement, one that would benefit you greatly." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not interest, but a deep, abiding sadness. It unnerved her. She pressed on the words, tumbling out in a rush of calculated desperation. "I will provide you with gold, a fortune, enough to make you a king in any other place. In return," she faltered. To say it aloud felt like a profanity here in this quiet, sacred space. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower than she could have imagined, like the grinding of tectonic plates. In return, she took a breath, the cold mountain air searing her lungs. "I wish to bear a son. Your son," she declared, the words hanging obscene in the pristine air. "Strong sons to carry a legacy." He did not laugh. He did not sneer. He simply looked at her, and for the first time Isabella felt truly seen, not as a beauty, not as a widow, not as a prize, but as a soul laid bare and found wanting. The silence stretched, and she felt the weight of the mountain's judgment in his gaze. When he spoke again, his words were not a refusal. They were a verdict. "Strength is not a thing you can breed like cattle, madam," he said, his voice impossibly gentle. "The strength that makes a good man comes not from the father's muscle, but from the mother's courage." He took a step closer, and she flinched, but he only looked down at her with an expression of profound pity. "And courage," he finished softly, "cannot be bought with gold." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering her composure. Her pride, her entire, desperate, ugly plan. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded her cheeks. He had not seen a client. He had seen a coward. The bargain was refused, but in its place a terrible searching question had been asked of her soul. And Isabella Beaumont, for the first time in her life, had no answer. Isabella rode down from the mountain a changed woman, though she did not yet know it. His words were a splinter in her mind, a piece of hard, uncomfortable truth lodged deep beneath the surface of her pride. The mother's courage. He had not just refused her. He had exposed the hollow core of her desperation, and the shame of it was a quiet, burning thing. She returned to a world of silent servants and whispering clocks where every polished surface reflected her own hollowness back at her. The gilded cage felt smaller, its bars colder. Lucius was a constant presence now, a spider spinning a web of polite inquiries and veiled threats, his eyes always hungry, always watching. He spoke of investments and land surveys, but his true meaning was clear. He was measuring her for a coffin. A week passed, a week of suffocating civility and sleepless nights. The memory of the mountain of the man who was more than a man was a constant low hum beneath the noise of her life. She found herself staring out the window, her gaze drawn to the jagged silhouette of the peaks against the endless blue sky. She could not stay away. On the 8th day, she created a pretext, a flimsy excuse about thanking him for his directness. She rode out alone, not with the frantic purpose of a bargainer, but with the tentative steps of a seeker. She found him not at his cabin, but in a small, sun-dappled clearing. He was on his knees beside a young deer, its leg caught and bloodied in a rusted hunter's trap. His hands she had imagined as instruments of raw, brutish strength, moved with the impossible delicacy of a surgeon. He spoke to the terrified animal in a low, murmuring voice, a language that was not English, but a cadence of pure, gentle reassurance. With a final, careful twist of his powerful fingers, the steel jaws sprang open. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply looked up as he began to clean the fawn's wound with a poultice of crushed leaves. "The world of men leaves cruel scars," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. Isabella dismounted, her heart aching with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. "You are kind to it." "Kindness requires no special effort," he replied, not looking at her. "Only attention." As he worked, the sky began to change. The brilliant blue bruised to a deep, angry purple at the edges. The wind died, suddenly leaving an expectant electric silence. A low rumble echoed a sound that seemed to come not from the clouds, but from the very bones of the earth. He rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "A storm is coming. A bad one. You won't make it down the mountain." Before she could protest, the sky broke open. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid silver sheets, turning the world into a churning chaos of water and wind. Lightning tore the heavens, and the thunder that followed was a physical blow. "This way," he commanded, his voice easily cutting through the storm's roar. He led her into the cabin, the heavy wooden door shutting out the deluge with a solid final thud. Inside it was a sanctuary of warmth and shadows. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs and rain. The space was simple, clean, filled with hand-carved furniture and a surprising number of books stacked neatly in a corner. He handed her a rough-spun blanket. "Sit." She huddled by the fire, shivering, feeling stripped of all her status, all her defenses. She was just a woman caught in a storm in the home of the man whose son she had tried to buy. The silence between them was not awkward, but full. He moved about the small space with an easy grace, preparing a pot of tea, its fragrant, earthy steam filling the room. "Why do you live up here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alone, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Some people," he said slowly, "find the company of mountains more honest than the company of men." He turned his slate-gray eyes on her. "And you, Mrs. Beaumont, Why do you live down there alone?" The question, so simple, so direct, cracked the porcelain mask she wore. An answer, honest and raw, threatened to spill from her lips. The storm raged. But for Isabella, the true tempest was the one just beginning within her own heart. She was in the monster's den, and all she felt was a terrifying, impossible sense of peace. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed a warm, living heart in the storm-wrapped cabin. Silas's question hung in the air between them, simple and sharp as a shard of ice demanding a truth Isabella had never spoken aloud. "Why do you live down there alone?" She looked away from his steady gaze, her eyes finding the hypnotic dance of the flames. "They call my home a mansion," she began, her voice a low, brittle whisper. "But it is a museum. I am one of the exhibits. A porcelain doll on a velvet stand to be admired for my Polish but never touched. Never known." The confession was a crack in the dam, a trickle of the lonely flood she held inside. "I am surrounded by 100 people, and I have never felt more alone." She finally dared to look at him expecting pity. Instead, she saw only a quiet, profound understanding. He picked up a half-finished carving from the mantel, the figure of a hawk, its wings poised for flight. His large scarred hands moved over the wood with a practiced tenderness. "The hardest woods make the finest carvings," he said, his voice a soft counterpoint to the rain lashing against the windows. "The pressure of the grain, the knots from old wounds. That is what gives it character. A life lived without pressure is just soft pine. It has no story to tell." He offered no solutions. He offered no sympathy. He simply offered her a new way to see her own cage not as a prison, but as a crucible. And in that moment, something deep within her shifted. The shame she had carried up the mountain began to feel less like a weakness and more like the beginning of a story. They sat in a comfortable silence until the storm passed, sharing the fragrant tea he brewed from mountain herbs. It was a strange, suspended peace, a world away from the ticking clocks and predatory smiles. When the dawn broke, it was on a world newly washed and clean. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone. She left his cabin as the first rays of sun crested the peaks. No promises were made, no bargains struck. There was only a quiet nod of farewell, an unspoken acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. She was no longer a stranger. But peace, she was about to learn, was a luxury the valley could not afford. As she rode down the muddy track, the feeling of sanctuary evaporated with the morning mist. The town of Prosperity came into view, and a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Something was wrong. The air was tense, buzzing with a nervous energy. In the center of the main street, a small crowd had gathered. And at its heart stood Lucius. He wasn't in his fine suit, but in practical riding clothes, a look of grim, theatrical concern on his face. He was speaking to the sheriff, and in his hand he held a tattered, yellowed piece of paper. Isabella spurred her horse forward, her heart hammering. "Lucius, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with sudden fear. He turned, his expression shifting to one of feigned relief. "Isabella, thank God we were about to form a search party. You were gone all night. We feared the worst." His eyes swept over her damp, trail-worn dress, a subtle accusation in his gaze. The sheriff, a weary man named Cobb, shifted his feet uncomfortably. "Ma'am, Mr. Sterling was just showing me this." He gestured to the paper in Lucius's hand. It was an old, wanted poster. The sketch was crude, but the description was unmistakable: a man of uncommon height and build wanted for desertion and murder, last seen in the Northern Territories years ago. The name on it was different, but the face was a cruel caricature of Silas. "A monster lives in those hills, my dear Lucius," said his voice dripping with false concern for all to hear. "A dangerous fugitive. And you in your grief have been riding up there alone. We must ensure the town is safe. That you are safe." Isabella stared at him, the cold, brilliant cruelty of his plan laid bare. It was a lie, a perfect, poisonous lie. He was painting Silas as a villain, her as a hysterical, reckless widow, and himself as the town's concerned protector. He wasn't just coming for her fortune, he was coming for Silas's life. She had ridden up the mountain seeking a man strong enough to save her legacy. Instead, she had led the wolves to the only honest soul she had ever met. Lucius held the wanted poster aloft like a holy text, the crude sketch of a bearded giant a damning effigy of Silas. The crowd murmured their fear, a fertile ground for the poison he was planting. They saw a monster. Isabella saw a trap, its steel jaws closing around the only good man she had ever known. A cold fury, clean and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, cut through her panic. She slid from her horse, her voice ringing out across the tense square, not with the hysteria Lucius expected, but with the ice-cold authority of a Beaumont. "Sheriff Cobb, you are a man of the law. This is a 20-year-old piece of paper produced by a man who stands to gain everything if I am left unprotected." Her gaze fell on Lucius, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. How convenient that this ghost should appear now. "Lucius, just as you grow impatient for my husband's estate." Lucius laughed a short, ugly bark. "She is deluded. The beast has bewitched her. Can't you see it?" She defends him. The crowd shifted their faces, a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Isabella had planted a seed of doubt. It was all she could do for now. "You will not act on this convenient discovery," she warned the sheriff, "until you have more than the word of a vulture." She did not wait for a reply. She turned, mounting her horse in a single fluid motion, and spurred the animal into a gallop, leaving the stunned crowd and Lucius's sputtering rage behind her. There was no time. The ride up the mountain was not a journey. It was a desperate, lung-burning flight. The trail was a blur of ochre and green, the wind a scream in her ears. Every shadow held the shape of a man with a rifle. Every gust of wind carried the baying of hounds. She was no longer a lady of leisure. She was a woman riding to warn the world of a coming fire, a fire she herself had inadvertently set. She burst into the clearing, her horse lathered and heaving. Silas was outside his cabin, splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe, the mountain's steady heartbeat. He stopped, sensing her panic before she even spoke a word. "They're coming for you," she gasped, stumbling from the saddle. "Lucius. He has a wanted poster. An old one. He's telling the town you're a murderer, a fugitive." Silas set the axe down with a slow, deliberate finality. He did not look surprised, only weary, as if he had been waiting for this day for 2 decades. He turned his gaze to the distant hazy peaks, his face a mask of old, settled grief. "The name on that paper is not mine," he said, his voice low and heavy, "but the ghost it belongs to. I've been carrying him for a long time." He gestured for her to sit on a smooth, sun-warmed boulder. And then he told her. He spoke of a different life in a blue soldier's uniform. He spoke of a commanding officer, a man lauded as a hero, whose heroism was a mask for a brutal, drunken cruelty. He spoke of a young Shoshone woman from the nearby reservation, and the night the officer's cruelty went too far. "I heard her screams," Silas said, his voice a raw whisper. "I was on guard duty. I did what any man should have done. I pulled him off her." His massive hands clenched into fists, the memory a living thing. He drew his pistol. We fought. The gun went off. The story spilled out stark and terrible. The officer was dead. The rest of the patrol, terrified of implication, had closed ranks. They named Silas the murderer, the deserter who had attacked his superior in a fit of savage rage. It was his word, the word of a giant they already distrusted against 5 decorated soldiers. I was sentenced to hang. He finished, his eyes still on the horizon. I escaped the night before. I have been running ever since. Isabella listened, her heart breaking. She looked at the man before her, a man whose hands could split oak but who had saved a wounded fawn, a man who had endured 20 years of exile and solitude for a single righteous act. She reached out her hand, resting on his powerful forearm. "I believe you, Silas." A profound, shattering emotion passed through his ancient eyes. It was the look of a man who had not known the warmth of trust in a lifetime. In that single quiet moment, Isabella knew her own truth. Her desperate bargain, her fears for her legacy, they were all dust. All that mattered was the man before her. She was no longer just his defender. She had fallen in love with his silence, with his strength, with the deep, wounded goodness of his soul. A sharp, distant sound broke the spell, a sound that was not the wind nor a hawk's cry. It was the baying of hounds echoing up the canyon from the valley below. Then a man's voice carried on the wind, amplified by the rock walls, clear and cold as a death knell. "He's up here. Spread out. There is no escape." The hounds fell silent. The shouts grew closer. Men with rifles and burning torches emerged from the pines, their faces grim masks of self-righteous fury, their forms dark against the encroaching twilight. They formed a closing circle around the cabin, a ring of fire, and steel meant to purge the mountain of its ghost. The cabin door opened. Silas stepped out, his hands held open at his sides, empty. He was not a monster. He was not a cornered beast. He was a man meeting his fate, his immense frame silhouetted against the warm light of the hearth, his presence a quiet rebuke to their loud, ugly hatred. Before he could take a second step, Isabella was there, moving to stand directly in front of him, a fragile shield of silk and defiant will against a tide of violence. "That's far enough, Sheriff," she called out, her voice clear and unwavering, carrying across the clearing. Lucius shoved his way to the front, his face a contorted sneer of triumph. "Step aside, Isabella. The town has come to deal with this murderer. Do not make yourself an accomplice. The only crime here," she retorted, her eyes locking onto his, "is the boundless greed in your heart, Lucius. This has never been about justice. It has always been about my husband's name and the gold attached to it." The men of the posse shifted, their certainty wavering. This was not the raving of a bewitched woman. This was the cold, calculated fury of a queen defending her territory. "She's lying to protect her outlaw lover," Lucius spat, desperate to regain control. "Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Cobb hesitated, his gaze moving from Lucius's frantic rage to the calm, resolute pair standing before the cabin. He saw no fear in Silas's eyes. He saw no madness in Isabella's. He saw only two people standing against the world. "I have proof of his lies," Isabella announced, her voice ringing with truth. She held up a small leather-bound journal. "My late husband's personal diary. He wrote of your schemes, Lucius, of your forgeries, of your attempts to swindle him years ago. He knew you for the coward and the cheat that you are. It was a bluff. The diary held suspicions, not proof, but it was delivered with the force of gospel." The foundation of Lucius's authority crumbled. The crowd began to murmur, their torchlight illuminating faces now etched with doubt instead of hate. They had come to hang a monster, but they were beginning to see the real monster was the man who had led them here. Lucius saw it all slipping away, the inheritance, the respect, the carefully crafted lie. His face contorted, the mask of civility finally shattering to reveal the rabid beast beneath. With a feral scream, he drew a derringer from his coat, a flash of silver in the dying light. "If I cannot have it, no one will," he shrieked, aiming the pistol not at Silas, but at Isabella. It was a fatal miscalculation. Silas moved. He was not a man anymore. He was an avalanche. He crossed the space in a single impossible bound, his massive arms sweeping Isabella behind him as the derringer fired. The shot went wide, a harmless puff of smoke. Before Lucius could ready a second, Silas's hand enveloped his wrist. The sound of snapping bone was as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. Lucius screamed a high, thin sound of agony and collapsed, clutching his ruined hand. The standoff was over. Sheriff Cobb, his face grim with the knowledge of how close he had come to enforcing a terrible injustice, stepped forward. "It's over, Lucius," he said, his voice heavy. He looked up at Silas, a new profound respect in his eyes. "And for you, sir, I'll be sending a wire to the War Department. It seems this town owes you more than an apology." The posse dissolved, the men melting back into the shadows, their torches now looking like emblems of their own shame. The dawn that followed was not merely the end of a long night. It was a resurrection. Isabella and Silas stood on the ledge outside the cabin, the valley below still draped in a soft blanket of mist. The air was clean, the world quiet. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and a new day was being born from the ashes. Isabella looked up at the giant who stood beside her, his presence no longer intimidating, but a source of profound comfort and safety. He was her mountain, her home. "You said a good man's strength comes from a mother's courage," she said softly. He turned his slate-gray eyes to her, a faint, gentle smile touching his lips for the first time. "And you, Isabella Beaumont, have the courage of a lioness." She leaned her head against his powerful arm, no longer a porcelain doll in a gilded cage, but a woman forged in fire, standing beside the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly strong. They did not need a legacy of gold and sons. They would build their own here on this mountain, a legacy of kindness, courage, and a love as wild and true as the land itself.